In this unit, we're going to start talking about logic, like ways to think. How can you think through things, determining truth values. And so we're going to learn to write conditional statements and then the different kinds of conditional statements that can come from that. So to start with, let's first define what a logic statement is. So a conjecture is an opinion, and it's based off of incomplete facts. You don't have you have incomplete information. So an opinion based on incomplete info. So, for example, somebody might say all dogs are black. Maybe the only dogs they've ever seen are black. But then when they're exposed to other people who may know other things, other people can give them what's called a counterexample. Remember, we talked about counterexample at the beginning of the last unit. A counterexample is an example of when that's wrong. Okay, it's an example of when something is wrong. It's proof that it's wrong. So, what would be a counterexample for all dogs are black? Anything can be a counterexample. I can give a counterexample, for instance, that my dogs are tricolored. My dogs are three-colored. And that would prove, if somebody was stating it as a fact, that all dogs are black, then I can say, well, my dogs have three colors, and that proves them wrong. Okay, so how about the next one? A quadrilateral has four congruent sides. Somebody may say a quadrilateral has four congruent sides. Maybe they misunderstood and they thought that all quadrilaterals had to have the same side lengths. Congruent here is the problem, not the four sides. So what's an example of a quadrilateral that doesn't have four congruent sides? Maybe you can have a rectangle. You can draw a picture as a counterexample. You could use a parallelogram. You could use words. You can say a trapezoid. Basically, you're looking for any four-sided figure. In fact, you could draw one that doesn't even have a name. Any four-sided figure that doesn't have congruent sides. And that proves that that's not what it takes to be a quadrilateral. What it takes to be a quadrilateral is to have four sides, period. Okay, the sum of two acute angles is an obtuse angle. That means you need to remember what acute is. Acute angles are less than 90. Obtuse angles are more than 90. So I am stating as a fact that two acute angles will always add to be an obtuse angle. And so you can think about it and you can say, well, 20 plus 30, so a 20-degree angle, which is acute, and a 30-degree angle, which is acute, is 50 degrees, which is not obtuse. So that is not always true. Can it be true? Sure. 80 and 80, those are both acute angles, and they add to be 160, which is obtuse. But I'm stating it as a fact. It's an opinion, and we're trying to prove it wrong. Okay? So let's talk about these statements. So rewrite the following statement in if-then form. So you may have to finesse the words to make them be, to make the sentences make sense. But you could say, if a right angle, or if an angle measures, let me back up. If the angle is a right angle. That part was stated first. It's right angles. So you want to say that first. That's your if part. If the angle is a right angle, then it measures 90 degrees. So we can convert a conjecture into what's called a conditional. Conditional means that one thing depends on the other. One thing happening depends on the other. Okay, so we wrote this as a conditional. Now, you notice like I had to start a statement and then I had to go back and kind of figure out how to word it the right way so that it made sense. You may have to do the same thing. Be willing to erase. One of the things you want to avoid is instead of saying if it is a right angle, try not to use the word it in the beginning of the statement. You want to be clear about what it is we're talking about. So if the angle is a right angle, then it measures 90 degrees. That would be what we call a conditional. It is our if-then statement. The if part of the statement, so in our case, the angle is a right angle. That's our if part of our statement. That's called the hypothesis. Now, that is the part that we always assume is true. Okay, this is the part that we always consider to be true. And we do the same thing in science, right? When you do a science experiment, you have a hypothesis and you're assuming that your hypothesis is true, and then you're going to try to come to a conclusion to decide whether your conclusion is true. So you made a statement in the beginning, right? You made an educated guess with a hypothesis, and then you're deciding whether you come to the right conclusion or not. Okay, so then the then part, which would be this other part, this it measures 90 degrees, that is our conclusion. So we use P and Q to talk about these. So the hypothesis is P and the conclusion is Q. Okay, and so the conclusion, this is what we're testing. That's what we want to know. Is this true? All right, so let's look. If it is Tuesday, then Phil plays tennis. So the hypothesis would be that it is Tuesday. So we're saying it's Tuesday. The conclusion would be then Phil plays tennis. Okay, if P, then Q. The P is the hypothesis. The Q is the conclusion. Okay, if P, then Q. You can also write it P, then Q. That's also another notation. If P, then Q is how you would read that word, that letter statement. So we have our hypothesis. So write the following in if, then form. Notice that the hypothesis doesn't include if, and the conclusion doesn't include the word then. Those are not a part of it. Okay, write the following in if-then form. So an angle of 40 degrees is acute. So we're going to write it in the order that it says it in. So we're going to deal with the 40 degrees, and then we're going to deal with the acute. So we can say if the angle or an angle is 40 degrees, then it is acute. Okay, so we just took that conjecture, if an angle of 40 degrees is acute, and we turn it into a conditional. So there are a lot of words that start with C, and you need to keep them straight. A conjecture is simply an opinion based on incomplete information. Okay, a conditional is an if-then statement. This is a programming issue, right? We do these if-then statements in programming. You can use them in an Excel document. If I use it all the time with an Excel that says, if it's less than 70, highlight it red. That's what happens in the grade book and Hack. When you have a grade that's failing, it may show up in red. So this is very common logic used in a lot of places in the real world. So if the angle is 40 degrees, then it is acute. Now, again, you can kind of finesse. You don't have to have those words exactly, but you can kind of finesse your words so that it makes sense. Okay, so a conjecture is an opinion based on information, and a conditional is an if-then statement. If the hypothesis, then the conclusion.